series of plexuses. So these are other, there's a connection. So this cavernous sinus has lots of connections, both with the outside world and with the venous drainage within the cranial cavity. You should be able to find all of these things in your dissection, but realize you're going to have to slit the dura to see the sinus itself. They're not going to have blood in them, but make a slit there, you'll see there's a canal there. Slit there, you'll see the transverse sinus. You can even see the impression in the bone, and so forth. Okay, the problem with these dural sinuses, a potential problem with these dural sinuses is they have no valves. So while the blood may normally flow from here to here, and then out the jugular foramen and out there, and here to here and out to there, it doesn't have to. It can go back and forth. Okay? Because there's no valves in these things. Unlike most of the veins in the outside world, there are valves. But that means you can get backflow from different parts of the body that can cause problems. Okay, yet another sawing. Okay, here we are from the top. Again, just to remind you, there's the periosteal layer of dura is fairly straightforward. Stays with the bone. The meningeal part, however, follows the nervous tissue. Okay, and that is true when we get down to this cavernous sinus again. So here's the meningeal part, comes around, and the periosteal part stays with the bone here. The meningeal part deviates. Okay, so here's the diaphragm celli there, wrapping around the pituitary. Here's this cavernous sinus. Okay, so there's the meningeal part of the dura out there. There's the periosteal part of the dura staying with the bone in this sphenoid region. These are your sphenoid air sinuses. Okay, so there is this gap of tissue in here in this cavernous sinus. It generally has blood in it, but there are various structures that are lying within it. And these include the internal carotid artery and a whole bunch of nerves that are at the edge of or within the cavernous sinus. And we'll talk about why this is a problem in a few minutes. Okay. So here's our cavernous sinus to blow up. There's your internal carotid running through the middle of it. Cranial nerve 3, okay, which is lying right in the edge. It's not actually in there, but it's up against the wall. Cranial nerve 4 is also sitting right here, out here on the edge. The first part, V1, okay, the ophthalmic branch of the trigeminal nerve is also lying in the outside here, and as is the second part, okay? But, more to the point, cranial nerve 6 is lying totally within the cavernous sinus. Number 6 you'll learn about tomorrow. It's called the abducens nerve. Okay? And it lies within the cavernous sinus. So if you have some pressure build up in this cavernous sinus, a lot of these, it'll push against these that are against the outside, but the one that's in the middle is the one that's going to get really squashed. Okay. This has all been building up to the fact that there is an area of the face that's usually often referred to as the danger triangle. Okay? Don't pinch pimples in this area. That's the bottom line. What used to be a very terrible disease is still pretty ugly, is called cavernous sinus thrombosis. So you've got this sinus, this venous sinus, lying literally in the middle of your brain, with all sorts of nerves running through the middle of it. And if it gets infected, it's going to swell up. It's going to do all sorts of horrible things, squashing all sorts of nerves that are within the sinus. And before there were antibiotics, if you got infection within the cranial cavity there, you died. It was fairly straightforward. Now only 30% of you die. Life's getting good. Okay. What do the nerves that go through the cavernous sinus do? well, we haven't gotten to that yet. We'll get that on Wednesday. But the biggie, number 6, the abducens nerve, causes you to move your eyeball sideways to look to the side. Okay? This person has cavernous sinus thrombosis. They can't move this eye to the outside. They can't abduct the eyeball. That's the least of their problems. Okay? And again, that's because if you get an infection here, it will, in addition to spreading to the rest of the cranium, potentially spreading to the rest of the cranial cavity and killing you, the first sign is that abducens nerve is going to be squashed. The way infections from the outside world can get to this cavernous sinus and from there go to other parts of the brain and nervous system, there's a connection through the superior ophthalmic vein. There's a connection from the inferior ophthalmic vein. So if you get an infection on your face and the infection travels up through here, it has the danger of coming into there. There's also a connection between the lower part of the face and this pterygoid plexus of veins. And again, an infection from the outside in the lower part of your face can travel back through the pterygoid plexus and also end up in the cavernous sinus, which is why this area of your face where all these veins are lying on the outside are places where you don't want to have infection moving in the opposite direction and going into the cavernous sinus. That's why that's called the danger area. So here's just to show it again. Here's the connection between the superior and inferior ophthalmic veins going into cavernous sinus. Here's that pterygoid plexus, which is connected to the lower part of the face and the lower part of the jaw, also connected back into the pterygoid plexus. And once things get in there, there's not a lot of movement. It's pretty confined space. So infections that get into the cavernous sinus tend to live well. Okay, another potential problem related to stuff we've already studied is before we pull the scalp off of the top of the cranium, we pointed out that the scalp itself has a series of layers, which if you play around with the words, can spell the word scalp. There's skin, there's dense connective tissue, there's that aponeurosis connected to the frontalis in the front and the occipitalis in the back. Then there's this sort of loose connective tissue underneath, which is called the danger area because infection can travel from one part of the scalp to another. And then on the outside of this bone, as you know, is periosteum, which is called pericranium. But we also pointed out, as we pointed out a few minutes ago, that this diploic bone down here in the middle also has a whole series of veins in it. Okay, so there's little veins in there. And then there are these little emissary veins that connect the blood supply to the scalp itself, go through little bitty holes that you can see, particularly back in the parietal region you can see them, connect the blood supply up to the scalp through these diploi, which in turn are connected with these venous sinuses, these dural sinuses inside, particularly the superior sagittal sinus. So it's another way in which you can have infection on the outside of the head or neck, of the head in this case. Bone can travel into, infections can travel into the bone in these diploic bones with all the holes in it and veins within there. And then from there, get into the superior sagittal sinus and so forth, travel to other parts of the blood supply, of the venous drainage in the skull. So that scalp wounds are particularly dangerous because infections in the scalp can travel to the inside of the cranial cavity and lead to infections of the brain, which we try to avoid. Here's a more graphic view. Okay, so here are these veins out here around the scalp. Then there are these little emissary veins that go from the scalp into these diploic veins, which have a whole network in there. The diploic veins, in turn, can connect to the superior sagittal sinus, and then they can travel. That infection can travel around to other parts because these veins don't have any vein. These veins don't have valves, so infections can travel around once they get inside. Other areas interest and potential clinical areas. Okay, so I said there's, I don't know whether I mentioned it or not, but the fact is, when you look at the brains that you will see soon, when you look at a brain from the outside, if you pull the dura off, you see the arachnoid. In that, because it's pretty, it's like saran wrap or at worst wax paper. Cerebral veins, the veins that are draining the blood from the brain itself, are traveling in the subarachnoid space. If you look at a picture of the brain with the dura off, you see a whole network of veins on the outside. These cerebral veins dump, up at the top at least, dump into this superior sagittal sinus. But the superior sagittal sinus has got to get these, there's sort of a topographic problem here, right? You've got these veins coming out of the brain, and they go into the superior sagittal sinus. That's great, but the superior sagittal sinus basically exists where the meningeal layer of dura is separated. So there is no brain beneath the middle part. There's that falx. So what you find is that the superior sagittal sinus is fairly narrow at its beginning, but when it gets up to the top, it spreads out laterally. It's just an extension between the periosteal layer and the meningeal layer. And this area where it spreads out to either side are referred to as the lateral legs, the lacunae lateralis. And the cerebral veins dump into those lateral legs. But I also told you that we're making cerebrospinal fluid, a new set of cerebrospinal fluid, volume of cerebrospinal fluid, every 7.5 hours. Well, if that cerebrospinal fluid obviously has to go somewhere, or we would have exploded a long time ago. The way the cerebrospinal fluid, which is all within this subarachnoid space, leaves the nervous tissue is through these little cauliflower-looking guys known as arachnoid granulations. So the cerebrospinal fluid in the subarachnoid space passes up through these little things that look like bits of cauliflower or broccoli, and they dump into the superior sagittal sinus, particularly out in these lateral legs. So if you open up that sinus in the dura, you'll actually see these little round, little blobby things extending from the subarachnoid space, and little cerebrospinal fluid oozes out into the veins and then gets trafficked away and goes wherever things in the veins go. Kidneys presumably, and then you'll make new, and this goes on forever. Okay, these arachnoid granulations in the lateral legs going into the superior sagittal sinus. This stuff's under pretty serious pressure because, like I say, you're making enough to replace itself every 7.5 hours. So these things are coming up a little pressure. They're squirting out cerebrospinal fluid into this superior sagittal sinus. Okay, and there you can see one. It's been cut open here, so it looks like little bits of cauliflower sticking out in the lateral legs. And these things, under pressure, they'll actually leave sort of dents, little dents in the internal side of the cranium, just as the middle meningeal artery comes up on the inside in the dura here and leaves a track on the inside of the endocranium. Likewise, these arachnoid granulations leave little dimples on the underside of the cranium known as the foveoli granularis. And you'll see those on the underside of the skull. Okay, so let's move on to other issues here. What happens when these various bits of venous drainage get torn? So I said that the cerebral veins are lying here normally in the subarachnoid space. If these things just pop of their own accord, say, high blood pressure, that's when you get a stroke. Okay, so that takes place in the subarachnoid space. That's where these veins are. and then they can cause you to lose blood. They can affect blood supply. Well, if you blow out the arteries are next to the veins. So strokes are busting of arteries in this area. That takes place down here, either in the tissue itself or in the subarachnoid space. These cerebral veins from the subarachnoid space dumping into the superior sagittal sinus. If you slam the side of the head here, this junction of where they leave the meningeal part of the dura, okay, and between the arachnoid here and the meningeal part of the dura there, okay, the blood from there will slide around here under the dura. Okay, they get torn as they're going into the meningeal layer of the dura, so they're going to get torn between the arachnoid layer and the meningeal part of the dura, and that's referred to as a subdural hematoma because the blood is below both of these layers of dura. And that comes from, there's a lot of inertia in your body, right? So if you're just sort of sitting there and then someone slams you on the side of the head, your cranium goes that way, but the brain lags a bit, and you can tear those little things. So tearing of these cerebral veins leads to a subdural hematoma, blood below both layers of dura, between the arachnoid and the dura. Another thing that you can do, however, is you can smash the side of your skull. Well, if you're so inclined. A blow to the side of the skull, say you get hit on the side of the head of a baseball bat, you're in a car accident and your head slams against the part of the wall, you can break these bones here, shatter these bones here, and they can cut bits of these middle meningeal artery, which is lying out here in the dura. Okay, and a place where this commonly happens, very commonly, is this area here where frontal, parietal, sphenoid, and temporal come together. You got little bitty, relatively thin bits, lots of junctions. You get the side of the head of the baseball bat or something right there. Little bits of these bones can break, and